Our heroes awakened from their night of debauchery quite hungover. Though they weren't very lively, they marched anyway. Regis led the way, and the group happened upon a group of peasants from a nearby refugee camp. They tell Zoltan that they are hunting a vampire who has been plaguing the area. Geralt steps in and tries to deduce the possibility of there truly being one present. As he expected, nobody had actually seen the vampire. They were basing their hunt on ambitions and superstitions. And despite being in the presence of a professional monster hunter, they dismissed any advice or help. As if that wasn't foolish enough, the peasants demanded Milva hand over her horse for their effort in tracking down the vampire. As you can guess, Milva strongly refuses, and one of the peasants makes a pretty foolish mistake, in the form of making some super sexist remarks directed towards her. Now, I'm sure you know by now, Milva is no damsel or homebody. She dismounts her horse and approaches the peasant and hits him directly in the face. His head lashes back, and she strikes him again in the throat. He completely topples backwards and cracks his head on the rock. She hits him so hard that the other peasants actually think that she kills him. The party, now joined by the peasants, travel onward until they reach the refugee camp. There are nearly 200 refugees, their wagons, fugitives, and scattered campfires. Not long after they arrive, the women and children in their company are reunited with some undisclosed long-lost friends or relatives, and they part from the party. Geralt and the remaining members of the group have intentions to move on, but they briefly linger in the naive hopes that any of the women might show a little gratitude. It proved to be a waste of their time, as even though the dwarves saved the women and their children's lives, they were still beneath them and deserved no gratitude at all. They make the decision to move on, and just as they do, one of the little girls that were under their protection approaches Zoltan. Despite her mother's ignorant opinion, she thought he and his companions were sweet. The gnome Percival gives the young lady an emerald from his personal collection, and they set off in high spirits, but it doesn't last long. Before they even get out of the camp, some men representing the man who Milva pummeled earlier were trying to demand blood money for their injured comrade. Trying to shake down a witcher and his company of tired dwarves is not a great idea, as I'm sure you could have expected, but it's actually Geralt who keeps things civil, defusing Zoltan, and requests that they be taken to the camp's acting elder, who they learn is Hector Labs. The scene set by the camp was one of a young woman tied to a wagon, and a single priest was next to her, shouting slanderous things about the young woman, accusing her of witchcraft and conspiring with the vampire that's been plaguing the area. Convincing a mob of people anything isn't hard if you promise them a live burning of a person, but luckily for the girl, the camp elder Hector was a reasonable man, who said while he was the elder of the camp, nobody was sentenced to death without proof of guilt. And thanks to the worldly wisdom of Geralt, Milva, Zoltan, and Regis, nothing stuck. It didn't take long for the holy man to take to some extreme measures. He demanded a trial by ordeal, in the form of taking one of the white-hot horseshoes from the fire burning by the wagon that the young girl was tied to, and carry it to the priest, and must bear no marks of burning. Sounds legit, right? While trying to quickly find a solution to the priest's ludicrous demand, Regis places his hand on Zoltan's shoulder and approaches the coals. He reaches into the fire, picks up the horseshoe, and casually walks up to the priest, moves the shoe to his other hand, and shows the priest his healthy, unburned hand. The priest accuses Regis of being the devil himself, despite it being his trial. He waves an amulet in Regis's face, and at this point everyone has had enough of this foolishness. But all the shouting and bickering in the crowd is drowned out by one person's scream of terror.
Nilfgaard!
In the snap of a finger, pandemonium spreads, and a witch burning turns into a mob stampeding in the direction away from the cavalry of Nilfgaardian mounted infantry thundering towards them. So much dust was kicked into the air that soon Geralt was blind in a sea of panicked people. He soon lost all of his companions. He hears the shrieks of a damsel, shrieking for his help, the damsel being Dandelion, of course. Geralt makes it to him, and grabs him by the collar to keep him from being swept away from the crowd. A passing wagon throws a hay bale that hits and flattens Geralt. Just as he stands, another wagon topples over and blinds Geralt in a white cloud of flour. As if it couldn't get any worse, his knee fills with pain, and he's unable to stand. He tells Dandelion to leave and to save himself. Now, Dandelion may be far more timid and is by no means a fighter, but he refuses to abandon his friend. Geralt urged Dandelion to hide under the wagon. as the roaring of the horses drew nearer. Too near, in fact. A passing horse hoof crashes with Geralt's head, sending his world into the black void of unconsciousness. Ciri woke from her sleep in a scream that echoed against all of the walls of the cave where the rats were sleeping off their night of excessive alcohol consumption. Her scream wakes them all, and Giselher confronts her. She tells him she had a nightmare in which someone she once knew was being trampled by horses, and she could feel them crushing her. She apologizes for waking her comrades up, and they all return to their slumber. This just furtherly proves the fact that Ciri and Geralt are in fact connected, spiritually speaking, of course. Geralt was woken up with a swift kick. As he awoke, he took the time to gauge his situation. Him and Dandelion were lying on the ground, and 2 mounted soldiers were hovering over them. Geralt looked around to see many soldiers around with the same uniforms, looting dead Nilfgaardian soldiers and executing the wounded. Both Dandelion and Geralt noticed their shields were decorated with lilies, which they both knew to be the emblem of the Temerian army. Dandelion had tried to use his uncanny charisma to convince the soldiers that they were friends of the Northern Realms, but to no success. The 2 were convinced that Dandelion and Geralt were simply Nilfgaardian deserters. They bound the 2 and attached the ropes to the saddles and dragged them to an improvised army camp. The 2 soldiers drag their new spies to their superior officer, one Daniel Echeverry. He immediately recognizes the famous poet and orders his men untie the 2. Echeverry made gestures of hospitality, but Geralt and Dandelion both insist that they leave immediately, and they almost get away, until a marshal enters the scene, who, unlike his brother-in-arms, recognized Dandelion's white-haired companion immediately. The 2 lock eyes, and he asks Geralt if he remembers him. Though it was 15 years ago, Geralt did remember. He then held out his hands, and the marshal had the 2 bound once again. Marshal Visigurd knew Geralt from Cintra, where we learn the stories fabricated by the Cintrans regarding Geralt and Ciri. According to the marshal, Geralt played a part in giving Princess Baveta, Ciri's mother, to a nobody southern man named Duny in marriage. After Paveta's death, Geralt wanted to take Ciri, but Queen Calanthe, Ciri's grandmother and Queen of Cintra, wouldn't allow it. So he waited until the disarray of the Nilfgaardian Invasion, which allowed him to kidnap her. He then hid her, and he sold her to the Emperor of Nilfgaard. Dandelion tried to defend Geralt, saying Ciri was abducted on Thanedd, and not from Cintra, and several witnesses can attest to it. He then continued on, saying Geralt never rescued Ciri from Cintra, but instead found her wandering in Riverdale, which is in Brokilon. Despite Dandelion's pleads, the marshal has no intent of listening to any of it. He looks Geralt in the eye, and he tells him that he will hang for his actions. In Chapter 5, we go back in time a little bit to Milva's perspective of the Nilfgaardian invasion of the refugee camp. When the panic first broke loose, Milva's first concern was their horses. She didn't make it back to them before she witnessed them being stolen, before she was swept away in the panicking crowd. She makes it to the Cholta, and hides from the Nilfgaardian army floating downriver with the dead. She makes it out, and goes in the direction of the horse thieves, who she eventually catches up to. She catches Dandelion's oaf of a horse, Pegasus, whose rider saw Milva, and aptly got off his stolen mount, and flees. Milva doesn't pursue, but carries on to Roach, and just as she was throwing her unfamiliar rider into the mud, Milva rode up to him and kicked him in the face, and dismounted. Unfortunately, as soon as she turns, she's greeted with a fist to her eye, and she falls to her knees. She's surrounded and shields herself from a flurry of blows. The thieves had intended on protecting their stolen goods, apparently. As I said earlier, Milva is by no means a damsel in distress, but for this rare occasion, she's very grateful when a lone rider on a gray horse enters the fray and begins beating her attacker with a knout. Once again, Cahir had proved to be a useful tale. Milva rises to her feet and kicks one of her attackers in the throat. Cahir chases away a few of the thugs and returns to Milva, who had caught up to her horse and retrieved her bow, which she was aiming directly at his chest. The two have a silent stare down before she lowers her bow. She was grateful to the man for saving her, but still isn't sure if he is her ally or not. He tells her to retrieve their horses and retreat with him. Despite her desire to hastily help Geralt, he assures her that getting themselves killed or captured won't help anybody, and then they flee into the forest. Once the night falls, the two settle to rest. The battle in the camp was over, and the forest was quiet again, and Milva takes the opportunity to ask Cahir why he has been following them and not going back to his people, to which he replies, "It's a long story." In the forest of Brokilon, we join a Nilfgaardian bound to a pole. He had been captured by Scoia'tael, and not just any Scoia'tael. Before the prisoner was Isengrim, and though Nilfgaard was allied with the Scoia'tael, he had some information that he needed to extract. For starters, why Nilfgaard had ambitions of kidnapping him. Upon threatening to douse his head with syrup and throw him still bound on an anthill, he sang like a bird. We now get a nice cut and dry explanation of what Emhyr thinks is going on in the north. For starters, the capture of Cirillo was assigned to Vilgefortz, Rience, and Cahir, and being that that clearly didn't happen, and the three had disappeared since, he ordered the capture of the three and any who had any intel regarding the events that took place, including Isengrim. The agents responsible for their capture being Stefan Skellen and Tawny Owl. Isengrim orders his men to release the man, and he proceeds to tell him what actually happened on Thanedd. Isengrim was contracted by Francesca Findabair to eliminate particular mages on Thanedd during the revolt. An elite unit of his was assigned to answer only to Cahir, and the minute that their ships landed on the island, chaos ensued. They were unable to eliminate the target mages, and as soon as they all began teleporting away, including Vilgefortz, Rience, and Francesca, he makes the decision to withdraw his Scoia'tael. They find Cahir bloody and gravely wounded at the hands of Ciri and his elite commando slaughtered, which we know to be Geralt's doing, and they take Cahir and retreat back to Brokilon. After nursing Cahir back to health, it's by chance Isengrim happens upon the Nilfgaardian dead drop that labels Vilgefortz, Rience, and Cahir traitors. Upon the discovery, he has Cahir bound and gagged and placed into a coffin to be transported by a hawker allied to the Nilfgaardian unit. And he didn't know how or why the unit was slaughtered, and why Cahir was released, which we knew to be Geralt and Milva's doing. Isengrim had the spy be given a horse and relay everything he just heard back to his emperor, and orders that he leaves his forest. Back with Milva and Cahir, Cahir told his new ally why she discovered him in the coffin of the cart, so she now understood why Cahir did not return to his people, but she still didn't know why he chose to follow Geralt in particular. Cahir now revealed the information that Geralt was going the wrong way, and Ciri wasn't in Nilfgaard. She inquires about what he meant, in which he replied again, "It's a long story." We transition to the Nilfgaardian sorceress Asira Nahid from the meeting of mages earlier in the book. She's joined by her friend Fringilla Vigo in the capital city of Nilfgaard, the city of the Golden Towers. The two discuss a few things. For starters, you may recall in the previous novel when Emhyr recruits an astronomer by the name of Zarthisius to assist in locating a specific individual by the use of their DNA. We learn now that it was Ciri that he was trying to track down, and Emhyr considered it a failure as the area he ended up tracking her with was the middle of the desert, which we know to be true, but you know. In addition to this, we learn that this isn't the first time that he's tried this, and that in the past it was Asira and Fringilla were the two that were recruited for the job, but weren't successful. The two go on to discuss the conspiracy in place regarding the fake lion cub from Cintra. They deduce this by comparing the DNA of the current lioness of Cintra to the piece of DNA that they were given earlier when they were assigned to track her down. Once they conclude that topic, they go on to talk about the Lodge of Sorceresses being assembled by Philippa, and how Fringilla would be Asir's representative, but we'll come back to these two shortly. Rejoining Cahir and Milva, they're contemplating crossing the river to investigate the now silent refugee camp, but Milva insists they have to wait till dawn, as ghouls were sure to be feasting amongst the freshly dead. While they're conversing, an aromatic smell catches both of their attention. Milva knew the scent and called out into the darkness for Regis. He came forward out of the darkness, and Milva inquired on the fates of Geralt and Dandelion, to which Regis replies, "It's a long story." Geralt and Dandelion are bound in a small woodshed. Dandelion, not wanting to face reality, was running through ways they could be rescued, while Geralt was just endlessly thinking about Yennefer, despite Geralt's assurances that they were in the middle of an army camp surrounded by thousands of soldiers. Regis was telling Milva and Cahir a plan for rescuing the Witcher and the poet. He told the two to take the horses and wait by the river, and that he would go into the camp and rescue the two. Cahir, not knowing Regis, thought he was just being arrogant, but Milva knew Regis was capable of more than he had ever let on, and agrees to take the horses, and she goes. Back in the shed, Geralt's inhuman hearing picks up that the guards outside had fallen asleep. Instantly, and simultaneously. His medallion began to hum, and soon after, Regis appears from the darkness behind them. He cuts Dandelion and Geralt from their bonds. He then gives Geralt instructions on how to reach Milva at the river. Geralt is grateful that Regis rescues them, but following their rescue, he tells him that it would probably be best if they never met again. Dandelion's confusion was ignored by both of them, and Regis agreed to Geralt's suggestion/threat, and like his entrance, he disappears. Once the two leave the woodshed, they don cloaks from the sleeping guards. The camp was quite lively, which made it a little bit easier for them to escape unnoticed. However, before they make it, they're stopped by a group who were on the lookout for deserters. Once confronted, the guards hinted that they might let them pass if they make it worth their while. Dandelion proves his usefulness when he pulls doubloons from his boot he was saving for just such an emergency. Fully aware of the value of what Dandelion had just dropped, they abandon any composure and professionalism and begin fighting over Dandelion's boots. Geralt takes the opportunity to punch the leader in the jaw, and the two break for the forest. The soldiers behind them begin shouting for assistance. The two keep on running despite the sounds of an army amassing behind them. They keep running, expecting to see a tree line leading to salvation, but they aren't so lucky. The two stop in their tracks and begin running back to the Temerian army chasing after them. Once again, the black-clad army was facing down our heroes, and once again, they were caught in the middle. As they're running back in the direction of the Temerian army, Geralt pulls a stunned soldier from his horse, and the two mount and break for the forest. During their frantic escape, Geralt suddenly hears a grunt of pain come from Dandelion, and feels a warm liquid run down his neck. Dandelion starts hyperventilating, and at the sight of his own blood, he tells Geralt that they've killed me. He then proceeds to faint and fall off the horse, and drag Geralt down with him. Geralt scurries to Dandelion's side. An arrow had grazed his ear, and had been bleeding profusely. Geralt shook the poet until he returned to the realm of the conscious. He helps him get back on the horse, literally, not figuratively, and gets behind him and makes for Milva. Back with Milva, she's worried that Regis was not successful in his mission in retrieving them. Cahir took it to distract her with a vague version of his story in which he rescues Ciri, saying she was surrounded by smoke and fire, and eventually Geralt reaches Milva and the horses. He pays no mind to Cahir, yet, and assists Dandelion off his horse, and once again, Regis materializes out of nowhere and rushes to Dandelion's side. Geralt threatens Regis, but he pays no mind to him, and he begins stitching Dandelion's ear, all while filling his head with admiration and the heroic battle scar he now has. Once he had finished, he stands up, and Geralt presses his sword to his throat. At this time, Regis reveals his true self. For 428 years, Regis had been alive as a higher vampire, which humans and witchers alike regard as monsters. Regis then tells Geralt to kill him, as he had no interest in living in fear for the rest of his life, because Geralt knew where he lived. Geralt told him to leave, and Regis agreed, if Geralt would answer him one question. He wanted to know how much gold it would take for Geralt to one day hunt him down. Geralt assured him it would take more than likely anyone could ever afford, and Regis smirks, and once again he vanishes right before their eyes. Geralt then immediately turns his attention to Cahir, who he also wants gone or dead. At this point, Milva kind of snaps, angry that Geralt keeps casting people out even though they've proven to be friends. She defends Cahir and says he saved her and their horses, so he's not going anywhere. She doesn't wait for his reply, but asks for assistance getting Dandelion on his horse, and they ride off along the river. They ride until they reach a point where they're safe from both the black and blue armies. Geralt takes this moment and decides maybe he should finally have a chat with Cahir. The two sit around a campfire, and Geralt first shares his piece on how he believes any being that played a role in Ciri's nightmares deserved a worse fate than death, and anyone who wanted to hurt her was to be eliminated. Cahir tried to defend himself, but didn't convince Geralt of anything, as he didn't trust him. Any information Cahir did have, he just assumed was regurgitated from Milva. Until Cahir mentioned that he was also connected to Ciri, like he was. He had all the exact same dreams and visions that Geralt had, and Geralt only knew he wasn't lying because he shared a dream Geralt had told no one about. In the dream, the rats enter a village called Bandit's Lair. Real creative, I know. The gang spreads out and does their own business. A rival gang had a large presence in the Bandit's Lair, and one was foolish enough to harass Ciri and Misel. He makes a couple of vile sexual gestures at the girls, and as soon as he gets close enough, Ciri cuts his throat, and then sticks him a second time. He topples to the ground and dies almost instantly. The other gang members draw their weapons, and everybody freezes. Before things escalate further, Giselher throws a bag of coin at the other gang's leader, saying, "The feud is over, and one stiff's enough," and everybody sheaths their weapons. Back at the campfire, Geralt was frozen in contemplation, both scared with the knowledge Ciri could be not herself anymore, in the sense that she can kill without any sort of mercy or regard for her action. Cahir also armed Geralt with the knowledge that she was no longer in Nilfgaard, and Emperor Muir was actually in possession of a false Ciri. Either way, Cahir dared not say anything else. He gets up and he wanders into the forest. After a while, Geralt calls over Dandelion and Milva and tells them to return home. Milva, being exceptional sick of Geralt's brooding, tells him to go to hell, and Dandelion and her carried on looking for something to eat. Geralt's already angry mood is intensified when Regis once again emerges out of nowhere. He said he needed to change Dandelion's dressing, and Geralt kind of gives up on getting him to leave. Once Regis changes the dressing on Dandelion's head, all of the present party decide they can work together to make themselves a hearty fish soup with the resources that they have. Milva even makes the brooding Witcher participate by cleaning the fish, and Cahir emerges from the shadows with an extremely large fish that he caught, proving yet again to be an asset to their party. The five stuff themselves with as much soup as they can eat, and then the silence brought on by food comas was broken by Geralt, who once again tried to convince his party to all return home. They all gently remind him that he can't do anything by himself, and not only does he have no clue where Ciri is, but even his full belly is thanks to his companions. Geralt doesn't agree, but nothing he says deters them. And then it's Regis who suggests their next move, saying he knew someone that could potentially help them find what they were looking for.